Today, we're unpacking the complex historical and geopolitical forces that led to the declaration of the Republic of Biafra. We're going to be focusing really deeply on the why here. Why did a specific region of a newly independent African nation feel completely compelled to break away, ultimately sparking one of the most devastating civil wars of the 20th century? To understand the massive impact of this short-lived secessionist state, we really have to ask how and why it came to be declared in the very first place. The Republic of Biafra existed for barely 30 months, yet its ghost absolutely still haunts modern political discourse, international humanitarian law, and global geopolitics today.
So here is our roadmap. We'll start with a fragile Nigerian federation, move into the coups, massacres, and flight, and then the actual declaration of the Biafran Republic. From there, we'll look at building a besieged state, the mix of geopolitics, oil, and starvation, and finally, the surrender and enduring legacy.
Section 1. A fragile Nigerian federation, colonial borders, and deep ethnic divides. We need to start right at the beginning of independence in 1960. At that time, Nigeria inherited borders from a 1914 British amalgamation that artificially grouped together over 250 distinct ethnic groups. Like a lot of post-colonial states, Nigeria's boundaries simply didn't reflect the older cultural, religious, or political realities on the ground.
And this was the core of an immense structural challenge. You're basically trying to stitch together deeply distinct cultural and religious populations into one unified political framework. It's like a giant, very complicated puzzle. You had three massive regions competing for power. The northern region was vast and politically dominant. Meanwhile, the southern regions, especially the Igbo-dominated East, were developing really rapidly in an economic sense, partly because of the discovery of massive oil reserves. This created an atmosphere of intense inter-ethnic rivalry. Everyone was incredibly suspicious over who would actually control the resources and the destiny of this brand new nation.
Section 2. Coups, Massacres, and Flight. The escalation of 1966. This already fragile political system shattered completely in 1966, setting off a horrific domino effect that split the nation apart. If we're looking for the direct catalyst for exactly why Biafra was declared, this is the critical turning point.
Let's walk through how this escalated so quickly. In January 1966, predominantly Igbo junior officers launched a coup, and several northern political leaders were assassinated. Just months later, in July, a revenge counter-coup by northern officers resulted in the death of the Igbo head of state. General Gowen was installed. But the violence didn't just stay within the military. By September, violent pogroms erupted across the north. An estimated 30,000 Igbos were killed, and up to 2 million fled their homes in absolute terror, pouring back into the eastern region as refugees. Peace talks were held at Aburi, Ghana in early '67, but they completely failed to hold. Finally, in May, the federal government decreed the division of Nigeria into 12 states. This was a hugely controversial move that carved non-Igbo, oil-rich areas directly out of the eastern region's control, massively diluting their economic and political power.
Section 3. Declaring the Biafran Republic, the May 30th Proclamation. Feeling physically unprotected and totally marginalized politically, the eastern region hit a definitive breaking point in May 1967. The sudden influx of 2 million traumatized refugees totally convinced the Eastern leadership that they just couldn't safely exist within the Nigerian state anymore.
At the absolute center of this breaking point was Eastern Military Governor Odumegwu Ojukwu. After consulting heavily with community leaders, he took the monumental step of unilaterally declaring the territory an independent, sovereign state, the Republic of Biafra. He directly cited the post-coup violence and the federal government's failure to protect Easterners as his ultimate justification.
He actually used these exact words to justify the secession. He framed it not just as some calculated political maneuver, but as a dire, absolute necessity for the sheer survival of the Igbo people. This wasn't presented as a simple power grab. It was articulated to the entire world as a desperate escape from perceived annihilation.
Now, imparting a neutral lens on this, it's absolutely crucial to understand both sides. Biafra's claim rested entirely on self-preservation and the universal human right to self-determination. On the flip side, the Nigerian federal government firmly believed that keeping the nation unified was legally and geopolitically essential. They argued that allowing Biafra to just secede would trigger the complete disintegration of Nigeria, and worse, set a dangerous precedent for the balkanization of the whole African continent into endless ethnic wars. Basically,
Both sides deeply felt that their very existence, either as a distinct people or as a unified nation, was on the line.
Section 4. Building a besieged state. Institutions of independence. So here's an interesting question. Once independence was declared, how did the newly formed Republic of Biafra actually attempt to function as a real state, especially while they were under immediate military attack?
Well, to legitimize itself, both at home and abroad, Biafra had to act fast. They established the Bank of Biafra under Decree No. 3 in '67 and immediately started printing their own currency, the Biafran pound, to assert economic sovereignty, especially after Nigeria swapped out its own currency to deliberately isolate the East. They also drafted the 1969 Ayara Declaration, which was this incredibly progressive document modeled on Tanzanian ideals that fiercely criticized imperialism. And honestly, most remarkably, while totally cut off from global supply chains, Biafran engineers indigenously refined their own fuel and manufactured weapons just to keep the war effort going.
But this brings us to a really harsh reality. How does any newly declared, unrecognized state survive a comprehensive economic and military blockade? As the federal government retaliated, the survival of these makeshift institutions was pushed to the absolute brink. Printing fiat currency without any international backing or exports, that quickly led to massive hyperinflation, turning day-to-day survival into an agonizing struggle for millions of civilians.
Section 5. Geopolitics, Oil, and Starvation. The International Response. The survival of Biafra immediately got super tangled up in Cold War-era global politics and, of course, the massive wealth of the region's oil reserves. This civil war didn't happen in a vacuum. The whole world was watching, and quite frankly, calculating their own interests.
So, let's look at the geopolitical chessboard. You had a few African states formally recognizing Biafra, and France offering some covert support and rhetoric about self-determination. But the heavyweights? Britain heavily backed Nigeria to protect roughly £200 million in Shell/BP oil investments. And in a bizarre Cold War twist, the Soviet Union also armed the federal government, meaning Britain and the USSR were actually on the same side. The United Nations and the Organization of African Unity flat out refused to recognize Biafra, strictly prioritizing the territorial integrity of existing member states over any secessionist claims.
Without that vital recognition from the UN or the OAU, the federal blockade remained firmly, rigidly in place. It restricted movement by land, sea, and air, stopping imports and communications. This transformed into a devastating tool of war, severely blocking humanitarian aid. The Nigerian government argued it was a necessary tactic to prevent arms smuggling, while Biafrans cried out that it was a deliberate, calculated policy of starvation.
3 million. Let the sheer weight of that number sink in for a second. An estimated 3 million Biafrans lost their lives during this conflict, with roughly 1 million dying directly from severe malnutrition and starvation. The images of starving children that were broadcast globally profoundly shocked the conscience of the world, and it literally changed how international humanitarian relief operates to this day.
Section 6. Surrender and Enduring Legacy. The Aftermath of Biafra. After 30 grueling months, the besieged and starved state simply couldn't hold out against the federal military advance any longer. The massive asymmetry of resources, compounded by that brutal blockade, finally broke the Biafran resistance.
President Ojukwu fled into exile, and the formal surrender took place in January 1970. What followed was a highly controversial demonetization policy that wiped out Igbo savings virtually overnight. Regardless of what was in their bank accounts before or during the war, former Biafrans were given a flat rate of just £20. This economic devastation deeply scarred the region. And if we fast forward decades later, we see the rise of modern separatist groups like Masab in '99 and IPOB in 2012, who continue to push for an independent state, strongly arguing that the core issues from the 1960s were never actually resolved.
Decades later, the symbolic legacy of Biafra's brief statehood continues to fuel intense nationalist movements. Old Biafran pound notes are still kept by many as deeply emotional artifacts. The flag of the rising sun is actively flown in protests today. The historical memory of the blockade, the 20-pound policy, and the massive, tragic loss of life remains an incredibly potent cultural and political force in southeastern Nigeria. Which really leaves us to ponder. The Republic of Biafra may have physically fallen in 1970, but its historical echoes clearly continue to shape the political landscape of Nigeria today. When a group of people feels their sheer survival is at stake, the idea of self-determination proves incredibly difficult to extinguish. Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and I encourage you to keep questioning the historical forces that shape our modern world.